faintest twittering in the hedges. The shrew mice are at play. A white owl floats silently by. The dome of the heavens, the Milky Way, the pipe of a curlew, the mellow notes of the nightingale, the cry of the mouse as the owl tears him limb from limb. Strength declines, passion cools, beauty fades, all things perish. These words come from a little unillustrated book entitled simply Life, which Edward Julius Detmold published in 1921. After the end of the First World War, he'd returned immediately to art. He was living again in Hampstead with his mother Mary, and now also with his father Edward Detmold Sr., who'd returned to the family after the death of Maurice. In 1919 he produced a folio of 24 nature paintings published by J.M. Dent & Son, some of which were later included as illustrations in W.H. Hudson's book Birds in Town and Village. He also illustrated several children's books, including Rainbow Houses, a collection of children's verse by the South African poet Arthur Vine Hall. And in 1921 he published a set of beautiful illustrations to Jean-Henri Fabre's Book of Insects. Meanwhile, he was also exhibiting in London galleries and creating prints which were sold in signed limited editions. By the early 1920s, many of his prints depicted scenes from Arabia or India, trains of camels crossing vast desert landscapes, or elephants laden with gifts outside Maharaja's palaces. These scenes were imagined. Detmold had never travelled to Arabia or India, but they allowed him to create new worlds which reflected his increasingly restless search for meaning in life and peace of mind. One of the most remarkable was his etching The Captive, produced some 6 years after his imprisonment as a conscientious objector. It shows an eagle chained to a rock in an imagined eastern city and displays the extraordinary attention to detail which draws the viewer's eye from the captive itself to the teeming life of the city, half concealed behind the eagle's perfectly etched tail feathers. The death of his twin Maurice and his experiences of war had left Detmold deeply troubled. His book Life was an expression of his quest for an escape from the feelings of loss, despair and guilt which haunted him. And it was followed by 2 more small books, both published anonymously: Selflessness, which appeared in 1922, and Greater Things and A Greater Than Things, published in 1923. The austere mysticism which he explored in these writings was deeply influenced both by Buddhism and by the syncretic religion Theosophy, which was then very popular amongst European intellectuals. Detmold's central message was that to overcome despair at the transience of life, humans need to move beyond appearances, material things and concepts, to become one with the transcendental reality, which is the ground of all being. Inwardly, he wrote, beyond that which I conceive lies that which I am. The key to this transcendence was the overcoming of self and selfishness, and this process was essential not only for individuals, but for society as a whole. But this, after all, was the 1920s, the age of prosperity and jazz and flappers and the Charleston. At a time when audiences were thronging to watch the films of Rudolph Valentino and breathlessly reading accounts of T. Lawrence's Arabian adventures, Detmold's desert landscapes were popular with exhibition goers. But very few people showed any interest in his reflections on transcendental reality or the path to selflessness. Of all his art, the works that found the readiest audience were his decorative images of exotic birds, fish and flowers, which appeared in his London exhibitions and in the pages of magazines like the Illustrated London News. In 1924, though, he published what would become perhaps his most famous work, his illustrations to Hodder and Stoughton's lavish edition of the Arabian Nights. This volume was one of the last products of the era known as the Golden Age of illustration, which had emerged with the development of new colour printing processes from the end of the 19th century, and centred on the production of beautifully illustrated gift books for children and adults. The Arabian Nights was one of the favourite subjects for these books, and alluring versions had been illustrated by Frank Brangwyn, William Heath Robinson and Edmund Dulac, amongst others. For Detmold, the project gave perfect scope for his imagining of other worlds. Edward Detmold's Arabian Nights illustrations are full of the exotic and the fantastic. But they're also expressions of his unending longing for something just beyond the horizon of everyday life. This was to be Detmold's last major book of published illustrations. He also completed pictures to accompany an edition of Hans Andersen's Fairy Stories, which was to be published by Hodder and Stoughton, but this never appeared in print. According to most accounts of his life, he then retired to remote rural Wales and lived as a recluse with his sister until his death. It's not clear how this version of events has come to be so firmly entrenched in the written record, because it's almost entirely wrong. In the final episode of this series, we will return to the story in search of the truth behind the lost years of Edward Detmold's life.